Hi everyone, I am back with another Grand Tactician the Civil War tutorial. This one is hopefully going to be short. I'm sure that will be inscribed on my tombstone. And this is more geared towards those who are beginners. So it looks like I have 7 of those matchups down there. I think that's just about all the ones you would expect to get. I can see we don't really have Infantry Brigade versus Infantry Brigade because I kind of feel like it's obvious how that goes. Uh, but I will start out by pointing out my assumptions that are written right up there for you. First, I'm going to assume that most of these matchups are one of each type versus one of the other, whatever the other is. And I am assuming that it's happening, the two units are engaging one another on open ground, not forests or swamps or anything else like that, and that it's level. Of course, as those things change, the outcomes of these matchups may very much matter. And I will kind of point out as I go along what little things you might look for to maybe change these outcomes. But if these come up when you're playing, I'm going to try to give you the best advice I can to win them. What I'm not doing in these 7 matchups is I'm not here to tell you that, all right, in this matchup, this unit always has the advantage over the others, all things being equal. Sometimes that is true, but I would say that for the most part, the best answer is it depends. And so that's what I'm going to get into. So let's get into it. First, the skirmishers versus the artillery matchup. This is one that I think in general tends to favor the skirmishers in almost every situation. Now, of course, at very long distances, because I didn't talk about distance under my assumptions, where the artillery can shoot the skirmishers and the skirmishers can't shoot back, obviously that advantage is going to the artillery. But from the time that the skirmishers can engage with the artillery, I think the advantage swings pretty wildly towards the skirmishers. Again, the things that depend, if you have good range on your infantry weapons, kind of regardless as to whether the artillery has good range, but if the infantry does, I would recommend closing distance and then going prone so that you're almost certainly going to be within canister range. And rather than eat that canister standing up in loose formation, why don't you go ahead and get on the ground and yeah, you'll fire a little bit slower, but you're going to take a lot less incoming fire. And when you have 200, 150 guys, skirmishers, who are shooting into that artillery, it's not going to be long before you start picking people off, you start disabling guns, and that artillery unit is probably not long for this world. So one of the many ways I recommend people deal with artillery is that if you have skirmishers who have maybe gotten around the flanks, depending on where the AI is put out its artillery, I think skirms are a great way to go after Arty. And if at first you don't succeed, the really nice thing about skirmishers is that once they retreat back to the parent infantry brigade, you just send out another 200, and you can do this over and over again. Your casualties, even if you lost more man for man, losing 100 skirmishers for an infantry brigade is okay. They can certainly recover from that. But the artillery is going to be broken and gone. That brigade, that unit, the battalion is wiped out once it takes 100 casualties, and usually far less than that. And again, that's a really high estimate. I did something, I think not that long ago, and the full strength horse artillery battalions, I think their maximum recruitment is around 110, so you don't even have to do that many casualties. All right, I don't want to get too bogged down in that one, but enemy artillery can be annoying. It can gain a lot of value if left unchecked. So throw out their skirmishers, get that artillery routed. It'll help make sure you win the range fight. Then if you can win the mobility fight, you're in a pretty good position. All right, skirmishers versus other skirmishers. The mirror match. There's not really much of an advantage. It's going to come down to unit characteristics. I would still recommend that if you can, try to have, well, that was my cat giving his view of it. Don't listen to him. But if you can go prone in this matchup, take the reduced rate of fire and the reduced range for the reduction in incoming shots. Of course, in this case, your skirms can, if they get routed, you just send them out again. I find that the AI sometimes isn't as automatic in resending out new skirmishing units. So if you lose the first engagement, you send the second out, and you may not have to deal with a third. And one of the ways you can prevent the AI from doing it, and they can also prevent you from doing it if they know what's up, is that once you have an infantry unit of any type, it might actually be any unit of any type, but certainly this is true with infantry. I don't think you'd want your artillery or cavalry this close to a bunch of brigades. Once you're close enough that you're within rifle range, they will not kick out another set of skirmishers. And then you get the number 3 matchup, which is that of skirmishers versus infantry brigades. So there's not too much to expect in number 2. Again, if you have a really big difference in the experience, the command, the weapons of one unit, then it's probably going to affect it. My experience is that skirmisher v skirmisher tends not to last very long. Other units of skirmishers and other units of other things tend to come up and get into that fight. But I would generally try to hunker down if I'm in that, and just take the reduction in casualties so that your folks don't rout, that they're holding their ground, and then try to move your reinforcements there and make it a 2 or 3 v1 rather than a 1v1, which is just so much of it is left up to chance. All right, skirms versus infantry brigades. This is a fairly common one. So the 1v1, which is what I said I was going to do, I'm pretty sure the advantage here is going to go to the brigades as long as they have the range to keep up with the skirmishers. If they're outranged by the skirmishers, they have a problem. They have to come forward, or they kind of have to just stand there and get shot. But when they've closed to within range that they can shoot back at the skirmishers, there are probably at least 10 times the number of men in the brigade shooting into that unit of skirmishers. Assuming it's level terrain, it's an open field, the infantry brigade is going to kill a lot of those skirmishers. The skirmishers are going to panic and rout, and that's going to be it. Once the skirmisher unit breaks, as I just mentioned in the above example, how the infantry brigade responds is going to dictate how this plays out in the long term. Because if the infantry brigade that won doesn't follow it up, and it allows the other infantry brigade, the parent unit, to kick out a new unit of skirmishers, and does this repeatedly, I find that generally then the skirmishers will end up breaking the infantry brigade, because there is a kind of relative casualty difference where the skirms are usually killing more of the tightly packed infantry than the tightly packed infantry are killing of the spread out, perhaps prone skirmishers. And so, the infantry brigade can usually win that fight a few times, but they tend to do it while losing the casualty fight. So the infantry brigade has to close distance with the parent unit of the skirmisher unit that just routed, or the infantry brigade can kick out its own skirmishers, which would then block the ability of that parent unit to kick out its own skirmishers. And then you've turned the tables, right? In number 3, you've gone from the infantry brigade in the skirm versus infantry brigade fight to the skirmishers in that fight, which it can be useful in a long war of attrition. The skirmishers, I think, can break down those brigades, but it's going to require the infantry brigades to kind of make some mistakes. So I think the initiative tends to rest with the infantry brigades in this initial fight. For number 3, that's me. Number 4, skirmishers versus cavalry. So this is one of the matchups that I think, probably along with the above, number 3, is a bad matchup for skirmishers, who I think generally have some decent matchups. If the AI knew how to use the cavalry against them, and usually they don't. So this should be, number 4, should be a bad matchup for the skirmishers. And the cavalry can really respond, I think, in 2 really good ways, and then in some other ways that aren't as good, but still effective. One way for cavalry to effectively respond to skirmishers would be to dismount, go into loose formation, in which case they are operating as skirmishers. It just so happens that cavalry brigades are also on the order of about 10 times as many men as a skirmisher detachment. And those cavalry brigades, once they've closed to within range of whatever rifles they have, they tend to fire at much higher rates of fire. So there's a lot more lead being slung from the dismounted loose formation cavalry guys than the skirms are able to throw back. The other way that cavalry should be able to break down skirmishers, though I can't say I've used this one a lot, is that they should just charge right into them. Now, I've said this is 1v1. I've already given you some examples where that's not true. If there are a number of enemy infantry brigades close by, you probably don't want to do that too much. Maybe if you're on the flank and you just want to break the enemy's flanking skirmishing unit, it might be okay, especially if they're far enough away from the parent unit. The parent unit is not going to be able to get good fire on them. But you got to have pretty decent micro, because you do not want your cavalry to stay mounted on their horses in a pretty tightly packed formation within rifle range of a lot of enemy infantry brigades, because then you're going to get to a new matchup, which is number 6, and that can go very badly for mounted cavalry. All right, the 2 other ways this can kind of play out is the cavalry can hop down, not go in loose formation, in which case the cavalry is operating kind of like an infantry brigade versus skirmishers. And as I said earlier, I think that that's generally one that, at least in the one-off of just that engagement, the cavalry unit is going to have the advantage. I think probably the least good way to handle this as cavalry is to stay on your mounts, stay in tight formation, and shoot from your horses into the skirmishers. Skirmishers are likely going to have you outranged if they go prone, and I'm really assuming the AI is a lot better than it is. I think they're going to win the casualty trade with you. And so I think that's the worst way to take it as cavalry. One thing I have never done is stayed mounted, gone in loose formation, and still tried to shoot at anything, including skirmishers. I would say that's probably going to end up somewhere in the middle of the range of good things. My go-to with Cav is get them off their horses, put them in loose formation, and just move them towards whoever you want them to move, and they usually cut right through it. So advantage is normally here going to go to cavalry if the AI knows what it's doing. Number 5, cavalry versus Arty. This is one of the ones where I kind of shrugged my shoulders. I'm not sure. I would say the majority of my experiences are that this is a good matchup for the cavalry if they hop off those horses, get loose, move up close, and they can either fire standing up or go prone. Lay down. They got a high rate of fire. They're still going to be shooting out a lot of lead. That tends to go quite well. I also recall 1 or 2 instances where I had pretty new cavalry, so they had low morale, not a lot of training. Their commander is not nearby. And I put them 1v1 versus an artillery battalion. The artillery battalion gave them canister, and poof, they were gone. They routed. It was a big chore to bring them back. But again, that was 1 or 2 instances. And anecdotally, it is usually far more successful in getting your cavalry into loose formation and getting them close into that Arty, so that those rapid firing rifles can do their thing against relatively small numbers of men in the artillery. Another way it should work in cavalry's favor is to straight up just charge in. Just get into melee mode, right? You're going to pay a toll going in, but you're probably not going to eat more than one round of canister on the way in, and you should get in there. That's the theory. In practice, it seems like the artillery tends to withstand those charges a lot better than I would think a 200-man, and that's the non-horse artillery, which isn't supposed to go that large. A 200-man artillery battalion would go against 2,000 charging cavalrymen. It seems like the cavalry should wipe them always, but sometimes they don't. The worst way to deal with that, I think, is to stay in a tightly packed formation and try to shoot it out with the artillery. You may still win as the cavalry, but you're going to give up way more casualties to canister than you should. So there are better and worse ways to do that. I know if it's my Arty, I don't want it engaged with cavalry at close range. If we're taking pot shots at cavalry that's moving around us because we got nothing else to do or whatever, fine. But it's generally not the most effective use of my artillery. I don't want it to be a close range fight. I generally don't want anything that close to my artillery, but that's me. All right, number 6, cavalry v infantry brigades. So we're not talking about skirmishers. Open map, level field. I like to say that this should go to cavalry. And a lot of times in practice, it does. Because a full-strength cavalry brigade is not that much smaller than a full-strength infantry brigade, right? It's 3,000 for infantry, 2,500 for cavalry. Frequently, the cavalry will have faster shooting rifles, but the infantry will have longer ranged ones. But the cavalry can also fight in loose formation, which the infantry can't, and that allows them to avoid a lot of the shots of the infantry, even if the infantry are able to hit them earlier. In my experience, though, the infantry tend to hold up pretty well, and in practice, there tend to be multiple infantry brigades, while you might only have 1 or 2 cavalry ones. I know we got to stay with the hypothetical, which is the infantry versus cavalry. And I'll say, in theory, it feels like the cavalry should win that 1v1. But in practice, to me, this just seems like the cavalry's morale tend to break first. And so they tend to run away. Both sides can go prone, which will certainly cause the fight to drag on a little bit longer. I'm not sure about this one. I can tell you, as cavalry, what you do not want to do, if you are in number 6, you do not want your cavalry on their horses. If you see that the infantry unit is wavering, right? So I think the flag is flashing, pulsing red. All right, you can stay on your horse and you can charge into them in melee. Hopefully you don't eat more than 1 volley. And there's a good chance you will break them in the melee. But if these are 2 units that are kind of just fresh out, moderately good training, morale, leadership, and all that stuff, do not send your cavalry mounted anywhere near those brigades when they can hit you with their rifles. It's not going to go well. I think you got to get dismounted. If you're going to be dismounted, you might as well go into loose formation rather than staying tightly packed, and hope for the best. Try to close distance, right? Because they will be able to shoot you first, so you got to kind of go into them. But then once you do, the higher rates of fire, frequently on order 2 to 3 times higher, and assuming that the numbers of men engaged are about equal, should allow the cavalry to wear down that brigade. That's the theory. But I think this is actually a pretty close one, and there's more room for error, I think, playing the cavalry in this matchup than there is the infantry brigade. And then there's the practicality, which is that if you have the infantry brigade, or even if the AA does, they'll usually kick out skirmishers in advance. They're usually going to have a lot of friendly brigades behind them, and it's going to quickly no longer be a 1v1. And in my experience, cavalry, when they get 2-3v1s against them, they break very quickly. All right, last one. Infantry brigades versus artillery. I guess we have to do the fair cases. What do we do once the infantry brigades come into range against the artillery? I would say at that point, as long as the infantry is shooting at the artillery or preparing to charge it or charging it, they're probably gonna win that fight. It's always a matter of how much damage Arty can do to those brigades as they're coming in. That is going to kind of swing how other fights go. If the brigade sits there and for whatever reason is just taking a whole lot of canister, right? I'm also assuming that the two sides don't have perks that are, maybe the Arty guys have the double shot for canister. But if those brigades take a lot of canister, they're just going to break from the mass casualties in a short period of time morale debuff. But this is another one where I think infantry brigades are generally going to have the advantage, all things being equal. They got to come in, they got to shoot on their way in, and don't be afraid to charge once you close distance. But once you've closed distance so that you're shooting into that artillery, you got 2,500 guys, assuming it's slightly less than full strength infantry brigade, who are shooting rifled muskets at about 200 guys. They're going to start dropping them pretty quick. Guns are going to become disabled, so the artillery battalion is going to break down quite quickly, and then the advantages are just going to accumulate to the infantry brigades. Plus, the infantry brigades have in practice a little bit more flexibility than the artillery. Right? The infantry brigades could kick out skirmishers in advance, which then we're not in a 1v1. I get it. Infantry brigades can also go prone. They can get close enough that they can still shoot at that artillery, and now the artillery has to try to hit them while they're laying on the ground. Good luck with that. So it's one of those that I tend to think is a pretty favorable matchup for infantry brigades. So I've done this, and it sounds like in the 1v1 scenario, the artillery almost always loses. I didn't do the Arty versus Arty thing because it's kind of like the infantry brigade v infantry brigade thing. It's going to be just up to unit characteristics, I think. And in practice, there are usually going to be multiples of these on both sides, and so it's not a very realistic scenario to give you. It does seem like Arty is maybe not that good, but I would actually say that I use it a lot. And forthcoming video, I'll talk about how to use horse artillery in particular in some hairy tactical situations to try to get you out of stuff. So I'm not saying don't take Arty, and I'm also not saying that infantry brigades. I think I said in all of these they have pretty favorable matchups against skirmishers, against cavalry, and against artillery. But I think I qualified all of those with, as long as you kind of know how to use them in that matchup, you should do all right. I'm a big fan of cavalry as well. I was not when I first started playing this game because I didn't know what I was talking about. Cavalry, I think, have still a lot of uses, and because of the ways you can change their formation, there is usually always a way to get a pretty good matchup against any other unit. Of course, the mirror match is just like all other mirror matches. It doesn't fit well in here, but leave that for when it happens. And against skirmishers, I think that these unit versus unit matchups kind of bring out what I think of them, which is that they're good. They have better uses and worse uses. I did mention that mirror matchup, especially because I think going prone might give you the slight advantage in it, all of the things being equal. But that skirms by themselves, if the AI could deal with them better, such as in number 4 with the cavalry matchup, I think skirms would be less useful. And even in number 3, even when skirms lose, sometimes just repeatedly spamming them actually allows you to win. Doesn't matter if you lost 3 routed detachments, they went back to the parent unit. If you're able to, in the 4th iteration of that, break that enemy infantry brigade, that was probably the right investment for you, because at the end of the day, you have a non-routed infantry brigade plus the skirmisher detachment from it. Meanwhile, the infantry brigade from the other side routed, and it's not able to send out, I believe it's not able to send out any more skirmishers as long as it is routing. So there is the time element which is one of the other things that I did not really include in the assumptions here. But yeah, how long this is going on and how much time you're willing to invest in a particular engagement might shift a little bit who's winning and who's losing. All right, it didn't go an hour, thank goodness. 25 minutes is still way too long, but that's who I am. I hope this helps you. I hope you're able to keep this stuff in mind as you go into the tactical battles. I know there's a lot of stuff in there that is it's a little buggy, it's a little tough to learn and all that, but hopefully now, as long as you're not dramatically outnumbered, you can see how to get the best out of all the tactical engagements that might come up. All right, folks, until next time, take care. So I did forget one thing in my initial 7 matchups. I excluded the Arty v Arty and the Infantry Brigade v Infantry Brigade. Those mirror matchups, but I did the skirmish mirror matchup, and the 2 that I left out, I kind of just left it with, well, they more or less do the same thing, and so it's about the stats. That's pretty much true. Of course, infantry can go prone or not, but leaving those there, the one mirror matchup I should say something about is the Cav v Cav matchup. I will say it is very rare in practice that my cavalry end up fighting the AI's cavalry, in part because the campaign I've been involved in a lot in the last month, the AI is just not recruiting that much cavalry. But nonetheless, if and when it happens, what's the best you can get out of this? Assuming other things are equal, it's just you against the AI. Get off your horses. That's kind of my go-to with most cavalry things. And that will mean that you are likely now at a melee disadvantage, but alright, fine. Because the AI tends not to charge its mounted cav into dismounted cav. So I would say get off your mounts. We're assuming a 1v1 in an open level field, and go into loose formation. There's really no reason not to. If the AI stays mounted, you're going to have guys who are dismounted and spaced out, much smaller profile targets, shooting at a number who are much higher up. And I would expect to hit more of them and have their accuracy reduced. I don't know, I'm trying to shoot from horseback. Seems like quite the feat. So I would say do that. Even if they dismount, in formation, then you're back to the cavalry, almost the cavalry v infantry brigade matchup, which is one that I still think tends to favor the cavalry, although it's a bit closer. And if the AI gets good enough that it dismounts and goes in loose formation, well, you're no worse than you were. I would say that's the best possible matchup, but even then, we're kind of just back to a test of statistics. Who's got the better quality soldiers and guns and numbers and all that other stuff. So I would say, since the worst situation would be for the AI to dismount and go loose formation, and you do something else, just do the best thing you can right from the bat. The other advantage you can try to get here is to also have your cav go prone. It depends a bit on their guns and other things, but if you're not too sure, if it looks like a dicey engagement, for whatever reason you haven't followed my advice, or there are other things going on in the battle, the morale is low, you don't want them taking rapid casualties, because that adds an additional morale debuff. At least my knowledge in the latest stage of the game is that rapid casualties in short periods of time have a bigger hit on morale. And so going prone, you'll kill less, but you'll also die less. And so it gives you a little bit of a clock to work with to try to maybe give yourself a 2 or 3v1. All right, that's it for that mirror matchup. It is an important one. It is a rare one so far in this game. I think it's an important one to win if the AI starts recruiting more cavalry and uses them better in game, because if you can win those cavalry engagements, that's going to give you the mobility advantage. You're going to be able to run around and capture victory points. You're going to be able to run in and capture the entry points on the edges of maps, which will delay or deny their supply and or reinforcements if the battle is one that's going to go long. So that's why I think it would be a good idea to have it, and there it is. It's a complete list, and we've run about a solid half hour. All right, for real now, I'm done.